My wife's brother pushed me through the glass door and called me nothing at the family dinner. I smiled as blood ran down my face. "You all just lost everything," I said. That night, I told the world who really owned their empire, and by morning, their perfect life had completely fallen apart. The laughter died like someone had flipped a switch. One second, the Donahue family was cracking up at some inside joke I wasn't part of, probably about me. And the next, there was nothing but the sound of my body crashing through the French doors and onto the stone patio. Glass exploded around me like a million tiny diamonds catching the light from the chandeliers inside. Each shard seemed to hang in the air for a split second before gravity claimed them, sending them cascading down like frozen lightning striking the earth. I felt the warm trickle of blood running down my left cheek, probably from where a particularly nasty piece of glass had caught me on the way down. My Italian suit, the one Miriam had insisted I wear because "you need to look the part, Carter," was torn at the shoulder and dusted with glittering fragments. The fabric that had cost me 3 months of careful saving was now shredded like tissue paper. But here's the thing that would have shocked them all. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't even was. I smiled. Not some crazy, unhinged grin that you'd see in a movie, just a quiet, satisfied smile that came from somewhere deep in my chest. Because as I lay there on that cold stone, surrounded by destruction and tasting copper in my mouth, I knew something they didn't. They had absolutely no clue what they had just lost, what they had just thrown away, what they had just set in motion. See, moments earlier, what felt like a lifetime ago but was probably only 10 minutes, I'd been standing in the grand dining hall of the Donahue estate. This wasn't just any house. This was Miriam's childhood home, the place where she'd grown up thinking the world revolved around her family's name. The dining room alone was bigger than most people's entire apartments, with its faded ceilings, oil paintings of dead relatives, and a table that could seat 20 without anyone having to make awkward small talk with strangers. I'd been watching them do what they did best, toast to themselves. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed performance that I'd seen 100 times before. Julian Donahue, the patriarch, the tycoon who'd built an empire on the backs of people like me, raised his crystal glass with the kind of authority that comes from never having been told no in his entire life. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than most people's cars, and his smile had that practiced warmth that politicians and CEOs perfect in front of mirrors. Then there was Blake, Julian's golden boy, the son who could do no wrong, even when he was doing everything wrong. He had that classic prep school look down to a science, the kind of guy who'd never worked a real day in his life, but somehow always landed on his feet. Tonight he was particularly drunk and particularly loud, gesturing wildly with his wine glass and talking about some business deal like he was the one who'd actually put in the work to make it happen. And Yvonne, Miriam's mother, sitting there like she was carved from ice. Cold didn't even begin to describe her. She had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were something she'd scraped off her shoe. Her smile never reached her eyes, and when she spoke, every word was calculated to cut just deep enough to draw blood, but not deep enough to leave obvious scars. I was the quiet husband in all of this, the outsider who'd somehow managed to slip past their defenses and marry into their perfect little world, the one they whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear, the one they called nothing when they thought I wasn't listening. But I was always listening. I'd been listening for 6 long years. And when Blake, drunk, arrogant, entitled Blake, decided that my voice didn't belong in their conversation about the future of the company I'd helped build, when he put his hands on me and shoved me toward those doors, I let it happen. I could have stepped aside. I could have caught myself. I could have turned it into just another humiliating moment to add to my collection. But I didn't, because I had been planning this exact night for 6 months. Every detail, every contingency, every possible outcome had been mapped out in my mind like a chess game, where I was finally ready to move my queen. The blood running down my face wasn't just blood. It was evidence. The torn suit wasn't just damaged clothing. It was proof. The shocked silence from the dining room wasn't just surprise. It was the sound of their world beginning to crumble. As I pushed myself up from the glass-covered stones, feeling the sting of cuts and the ache of bruises that would be purple by morning, I looked back through the shattered doorway at their faces. Julian's mouth was hanging open like he couldn't believe what his precious son had just done. Yvonne had gone even paler than usual. Miriam looked horrified but not surprised. Never surprised. And Blake was staring at his hands like he couldn't believe they belonged to him. The night had finally begun. My name is Carter Wells, and I'm 36 years old. Though some days I feel like I've lived about 3 lifetimes crammed into those years. By training, I'm an engineer, the kind of guy who sees problems and can't sleep until I figured out how to fix them. By instinct, I'm an entrepreneur, always looking for the angle nobody else has thought of, always betting on the long shot that everyone else thinks is crazy. When I married Miriam 7 years ago, I genuinely believed in love. Not the Hollywood version with the dramatic music and the perfect lighting, but the real deal. The kind where you wake up every morning grateful that this person chose to build a life with you. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was beautiful, sure, but more than that, she was smart and funny, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in any room. What I didn't know, what I was too damn naive to see, was that her family looked at me like I was a piece of furniture they'd inherited from a dead relative, something they'd tolerate until they figured out how to get rid of it. See, I wasn't from money. My dad worked construction and my mom cleaned houses to make ends meet. I grew up in a neighborhood where people fixed their own cars because they couldn't afford to take them to a shop, where going out to dinner meant McDonald's was a special occasion. I earned my engineering degree on scholarships and student loans that took me 8 years to pay off, working nights at a warehouse to cover rent and ramen noodles. The Donna, on the other hand, had connections going back generations. They knew senators by their first names, had country club memberships that got passed down like family heirlooms, and thought struggling meant having to wait 6 months instead of 3 for their custom yacht to be delivered. To them, I was basically a caveman who'd somehow learned to wear a suit and use proper table manners. But here's the thing that really gets me fired up. I had vision. While Blake was spending his trust fund on expensive cars and trips to Europe to find himself, I was building something real. Donahue Enterprises had this clean energy division that was basically a joke when I first walked into their offices. It was hemorrhaging money, producing technology that was 10 years behind the competition and staffed by a bunch of guys who treated it like a side project they worked on when they felt like it. I saw the potential immediately. Clean energy wasn't just some trendy buzzword. It was the future, and whoever got there first was going to make serious money. I threw myself into that division like my life depended on it because, in a lot of ways, it did. I redesigned their solar panel efficiency systems, streamlined their wind turbine production, and developed new battery storage technology that could actually compete with what Tesla was putting out. I worked 60-hour weeks while Blake played polo on weekends and Miriam went to yoga brunches with her girlfriends, talking about juice cleanses and whatever guru they were following that month. I missed family dinners, skipped vacations, and turned down job offers from competitors because I believed I was building something with the Donahues, not just for them. And it worked. Over 4 years, I transformed their struggling side project into a billion-dollar venture. Not million, billion, with a capital B. The Clean Energy Division went from being the embarrassing stepchild of Donahue Enterprises to being their biggest profit center. Major corporations were lining up to license our technology. Environmental groups were praising our innovations. Industry magazines were writing cover stories about our breakthrough designs. The whole damn empire was leaning on the work I was doing, the systems I'd built, the relationships I'd cultivated with suppliers and clients. When government contracts needed to be negotiated, they sent me. When technical problems needed solving, they called me. When investors wanted detailed presentations about future projections, guess who spent weekends putting together PowerPoint presentations? But here's where it gets really twisted. I wasn't listed on any of the paperwork. My name didn't appear on patent applications for technology I designed. I didn't have equity in the division. I'd essentially created from scratch. I wasn't even getting proper credit in company newsletters or press releases. When Bloomberg wrote that big feature about Donahue Enterprises' Green Revolution, they quoted Julian and Blake extensively. But my name appeared exactly once in a photo caption spelled wrong. No equity, no credit, no recognition. Hell, half the time I couldn't even get a simple thank you for working through Christmas to meet a deadline that Blake had promised a client without bothering to check if it was actually possible. And when I finally worked up the nerve to speak up about it, when I suggested maybe it was time to discuss my official role in the company or perhaps some kind of profit-sharing arrangement that reflected my actual contributions, Miriam would give me this patronizing smile and tell me to be patient. "They'll come around, Carter," she'd say, patting my hand like I was a child who didn't understand how the grown-up world worked. "You just have to give them time to see what I see in you." But they didn't come around. They never had any intention of coming around. I was useful to them, sure, but I wasn't family. I wasn't one of them. And in their world, that meant I would always be disposable, no matter how much money I made them or how many problems I solved. The worst part, deep down, I'd known it all along. I'd just been too hopeful, too stupidly optimistic to admit it to myself. It started with a ledger that I was never supposed to see. Hell, I'm pretty sure it was never supposed to exist in the first place, at least not where anyone with half a brain could stumble across it. But that's the thing about working late nights in an office building when everyone else has gone home to their fancy dinners and charity golf. You end up in places you're not supposed to be, touching things you're not supposed to touch. I was pulling another all-nighter trying to figure out why our energy usage stats for the Newark facility weren't adding up. The numbers looked wrong, but not wrong in the way that screams mistake. Wrong in the way that makes you squint at your computer screen and wonder if you're losing your mind. Our reported energy consumption was about 30% higher than what our actual output should have required, which made absolutely no sense from an engineering standpoint. So there I was, digging through filing cabinets in the basement archive room at 2 in the morning, looking for the original utility contracts that might explain the discrepancy. The basement smelled like old paper and that weird industrial cleaning solution they use in office buildings. And the fluorescent lights kept flickering like something out of a horror movie. Most people would have said screw it and gone home, but I've never been most people. That's when I found it, wedged between a stack of environmental impact reports and some old insurance documents. A leather-bound ledger that looked like it belonged in a 1950s accounting office. The kind of thing you'd expect to find in some mob boss's restaurant, not in the files of a supposedly legitimate energy company. The cover was worn smooth, and when I opened it, I could smell that particular scent of old paper and ink that you only get from documents that have been around for a while. At first glance, it looked like standard bookkeeping: revenue columns, expense tracking, the usual corporate paper trail that accountants love and normal people find boring as hell. But I'm an engineer, which means I'm naturally suspicious of anything that doesn't add up perfectly. And these numbers were definitely not adding up. There were entries for payments to companies I'd never heard of, firms with generic names like Coastal Consulting Services and Atlantic Resource Management. The amounts were significant, sometimes 6 figures, but there was no explanation of what services these companies were supposed to be providing. More importantly, I couldn't find any corresponding invoices or contracts in our official filing system. Being the obsessive type, I started tracing these mysterious payments. I spent the next 3 weeks coming in early and staying late, following paper trails that led to more paper trails, cross-referencing bank statements with expenditure reports, and slowly piecing together a puzzle that made my stomach turn. What I discovered was absolutely stunning. And I mean that in the worst possible way. Blake and Julian hadn't just been sloppy with the books. They've been running a full-scale embezzlement operation for years. Those mystery companies, they were shell corporations, fake businesses that existed only on paper with bank accounts that funneled money directly into personal accounts controlled by the Donahue family. They'd been stealing from their own company systematically and deliberately, using a network of front companies to hide the money trail. Millions of dollars that should have gone toward research and development, employee benefits, or facility improvements had instead been diverted into offshore accounts. I found records of consulting fees paid to companies that had no employees, no offices, and no actual business operations. But the embezzlement was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, I discovered something even worse. They'd been falsifying environmental permits for years. The clean energy division that I'd worked so hard to build, the projects I'd been so proud of, were operating under fraudulent documentation. Pollution reports had been altered, safety inspections had been faked, and regulatory compliance documents had been forged. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was criminal, the kind of stuff that could result in federal charges, massive fines, and prison time. The Environmental Protection Agency doesn't mess around when it comes to permit fraud, especially when it involves energy production facilities. We're talking about potential environmental disasters that could affect thousands of people, all covered up so that Donahue's could keep their profit margins looking pretty. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after that first night of real discovery, my hands shaking as I held printouts of bank transfers and forged inspection reports. Part of me wanted to march straight into Julian's office and confront him, to demand explanations and threaten to expose everything. But the smarter part of me, the part that had learned to think 3 moves ahead, knew that would be a mistake. Instead, I did what any good engineer would do. I made backups, lots of them. I copied every document, photographed every page, and stored digital copies in multiple locations. I was careful about it, too. I never printed anything on company printers, never used company computers for searches, and never accessed the files during normal business hours when security cameras might catch me in areas I wasn't supposed to be. Over the next month, I built a comprehensive archive of their crimes. Every fake invoice, every forged permit, every illegal transfer. I organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it with official company reports, and documented every single discrepancy. I was building a case even though I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. And then somewhere between the third week of digging and the moment I realized just how deep this corruption went, I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something much more dangerous. I started planning. Miriam once told me something that I thought was cute at the time, but later realized was the key to their entire downfall. We were lying in bed on a Sunday morning and she was telling me about how her family did business. Daddy says, never put anything important in writing. She'd laughed, running her fingers through my hair like she was sharing some adorable family quirk. It's safer that way. Handshake deals, verbal agreements. Keep the lawyers out of it as much as possible. At the time, I thought it was just old-school business philosophy.
The kind of thing that probably worked fine when deals were smaller and everyone knew everyone.
But as I sat in my home office at 3 a.m, surrounded by copies of all their fraudulent documents, I realized that their casual approach to documentation was about to cost them everything they'd built. See, when you don't put things in writing, you don't have legal protections. When you operate on handshakes and assumptions, you leave yourself vulnerable to people who actually understand how corporate law works. And, thanks to my discovery of their criminal activities, I now had both the motivation and the leverage to exploit every single gap in their armor. The first person I called was Dr. Raina Lin, an old friend from my graduate school days who'd gone on to become one of the most feared corporate attorneys in Washington, D.C. Rhea was the kind of lawyer who could smell blood in the water from 3 states away. And when I told her what I'd found, I could practically hear her grinning through the phone. "Carter," she said in that sharp, precise way she had of speaking, "are you telling me that Julian Donahue has been running a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme with virtually no legal safeguards in place?" When I confirmed that yes, that was exactly what I was saying. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh a shark might make if sharks could laugh. "How quickly can you get to D.C.?" she asked. 2 days later, I was sitting in Raina's corner office looking out at the Toac River while she explained exactly how we were going to take down the Donahue empire. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We were going to acquire controlling interest in Donahue Enterprises legally and quietly, using their own carelessness against them. "The beautiful thing about family-controlled companies," Raina explained, pulling up corporate filings on her laptop, "is that they often get sloppy about tracking minority shareholders. They assume that because they control the biggest chunk, the little guys don't matter. But those little guys add up. And if you know where to look, you can often find people who are tired of being ignored." She was right. Donahue Enterprises had dozens of minority shareholders, early investors, former employees who'd been granted stock options, distant relatives who'd inherited small percentages over the years. Most of them owned anywhere from 0.5% to 3% of the company, and none of them had any real say in how things were run. Julian and his immediate family controlled about 45% directly, with the assumption that they could always count on votes from loyal board members and friendly investors to maintain control. But assumptions, as I was learning, could be dangerous things. Working with Raina, I began systematically approaching these forgotten shareholders. We set up shell companies and investment firms to handle the purchases, making it look like routine market activity rather than a coordinated takeover attempt. The key was patience and discretion. We couldn't let the Donahues realize what was happening until it was too late to stop it. Some of the shareholders were easy to convince. Old-timers who'd been ignored for years and were happy to cash out for more than their shares had ever been worth on the open market. Others needed more persuasion. But when you're offering premium prices for stock that's been stagnant for years, most people don't ask too many questions. The process took 4 months of careful maneuvering, 4 months of late-night phone calls, discreet meetings in hotel lobbies, and wire transfers that were structured to avoid triggering any SEC reporting requirements. Ray handled the legal complexities while I provided the financing using a combination of my own savings, loans secured against intellectual property I developed, and backing from investors who were intrigued by the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of what was clearly going to be a major corporate shakeup. The genius of it was that Julian and Blake had no idea what was happening. Their quarterly reports showed normal market activity, shares changing hands at reasonable prices, nothing that would raise red flags with their accountants or financial advisors. They were so focused on their embezzlement schemes and their environmental fraud that they never bothered to pay attention to something as mundane as minority shareholder transactions. By the time Blake started asking questions about unusual trading activity, it was already too late. I had reached the magic number, 51% ownership of Donahue Enterprises. Not through a hostile takeover, not through some dramatic boardroom coup, but through simple legal stock purchases that their own sloppy record-keeping had made possible. The day I realized I'd crossed the threshold, I sat in my car outside the company headquarters for 20 minutes, just staring at the building that I now technically owned. It felt surreal, like waking up from a dream where you'd won the lottery. Except this wasn't luck. This was strategy, patience, and the kind of careful planning that the Donahues had never bothered to learn. I wasn't just the quiet husband anymore. I wasn't the disposable engineer they could push around. I was the majority shareholder of a billion-dollar company, and they had absolutely no clue what was about to hit them. The invitation came on cream-colored paper with embossed lettering, the kind of formal stationery that probably cost more per sheet than most people spend on groceries in a week. The Donahue family cordially invites you to join them for dinner. It read in Yvonne's perfect cursive handwriting. But time for family reconciliation and moving forward together. I knew it was bullsty the second I opened the envelope. The Donahues didn't do reconciliation. They did manipulation, control, and calculated power plays disguised as family gatherings. But I also knew this was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. They were bringing me into their den, probably planning to corner me, intimidate me, maybe even try to buy me off with some pathetic offer that they thought would make me go away quietly. What they didn't realize was that I was walking into their trap with 51% ownership of their company, burning a hole in my pocket like a loaded gun. I arrived at the estate at exactly 7 because being late would have given them ammunition to use against me, and being early would have made me look desperate. The house looked the same as always, intimidatingly massive with those ridiculous columns and perfectly manicured gardens that required a team of landscapers to maintain. But now, instead of feeling small and out of place, I felt like I was visiting property that I technically owned a controlling interest in. Miriam met me at the door, and I could tell immediately that something was off. She looked nervous, more nervous than I'd seen her in years. Her smile was too bright, too forced, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to jump out and surprise us. "I'm so glad you came," she said, but her voice had that artificial quality that meant she was reading from a script someone else had written. The family was already assembled in the dining room when we walked in. Julian sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, dressed in one of his expensive suits and wearing that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Blake was already working on what looked like his 3rd or 4th glass of wine, his face flushed and his gestures loose in that way that meant he was well on his way to being drunk. Yvonne was positioned strategically at Julian's right hand, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, but putting on her best performance of gracious hostess. The dinner itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. They made small talk about the weather, asked polite questions about my work that they clearly didn't care about the answers to, and generally treated me with the kind of fake courtesy that rich people use when they're forced to interact with the help. I played along, making appropriate responses and pretending I didn't notice the meaningful looks they kept exchanging when they thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was always paying attention. That was something they'd never understood about me. About halfway through the main course, some kind of fancy fish that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, Julian cleared his throat in that authoritative way that meant he was about to make an announcement. "Carter," he said, setting down his wine glass with theatrical precision. "We've been talking as a family, and we think it might be time to make some changes to the business structure." Here it comes, I thought. The real reason for this little gathering. Blake leaned forward, wine making him bolder than usual. "We're thinking about selling off the clean energy division," he said like he was discussing the weather. "There's been some interest from overseas investors, and frankly, it's become more trouble than it's worth. My division, the project I'd built from nothing, the billion-dollar venture that had saved their company from irrelevance. They wanted to dump it and cash out, probably to cover up some of their embezzlement, or pay for their legal problems when their fraud inevitably came to light." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's interesting," I said calmly. "Have you run the numbers on what that would mean for long-term revenue projections?" Julian waved his hand dismissively. "We've got people handling the details. The point is, we think it's time to streamline operations, focus on our core competencies." That's when I stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily, just stood up like I was getting ready to leave. The conversation died instantly, all eyes turning to me as I straightened my jacket and looked around the table at their confused faces. "That won't be happening," I said quietly. Blake scoffed, the wine making him stupid. "Come on, Carter, this isn't really your call to make." "Actually," I said, still in that calm, conversational tone. "It is." Julian's practiced smile faltered slightly. "Son, I think you might be misunderstanding your role here. Sit down, Carter." Blake interrupted, his voice taking on that entitled edge that had always made my skin crawl. "Nobody asked for your opinion." When I didn't move, when I just stood there looking at them with what I hoped was a pleasant expression, Blake's face started turning red. He'd always been a hothead when he drank, always ready to throw his weight around when he thought he had the upper hand. I said, "Sit down," he repeated, pushing his chair back from the table. "No," I said simply. That's when he snapped. Blake lurched to his feet, wine slashing out of his glass, and before anyone could react, he had his hands on my shoulders. "You don't get to tell us no in our own house," he shouted, and then he shoved me hard toward the French doors that led out to the patio. I could have resisted. I could have stepped aside, could have deflected his clumsy, drunk shove, could have turned it into just another embarrassing family moment. But I didn't. I let momentum carry me backward. Let my body crash through those expensive glass doors in an explosion of crystal and chaos. The silence that followed was absolute and perfect. I left that dinner with blood on my collar and fire in my chest. The drive home felt like I was floating, like I was watching someone else grip the steering wheel while my mind raced through everything that was about to happen. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked like a man who'd been in a fight, which technically I had been. There was a cut on my cheek that had already stopped bleeding. My shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there were tiny pieces of glass embedded in my jacket that caught the streetlights like stars. But I was smiling. I couldn't stop smiling. The second I walked through my front door, I was on the phone with Raina. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting for my call. "How did it go?" she asked without any small talk. "Blake just gave us everything we need," I said, pulling off my jacket and shaking glass fragments onto the hardwood floor. "Physical assault witnesses, and the perfect justification for what we're about to do." "Outstanding," Reese said, and I could hear her fingers already flying across her keyboard. "Are you ready to execute Protocol Eclipse?" Protocol Eclipse? We'd named it after the way a solar eclipse blocks out the sun. Sudden, dramatic, and impossible to ignore once it starts. For the past 2 months, while I'd been quietly acquiring shares and building my case against the Donahues, Raina had been preparing for this exact moment. Press releases, shareholder memos, legal documentation, media contacts. Everything was ready to go, just waiting for the right trigger. Blake, shoving me through a glass door. That was one hell of a trigger. "Light it up," I told her. What happened next was like watching a perfectly choreographed explosion in slow motion. Ria had spent years building relationships with financial journalists, business reporters, and industry analysts. She knew exactly who to call, exactly what angle would get their attention, and exactly how to present our evidence in a way that would make it impossible for the media to ignore. The first press release went out at 11:47 p.m., hitting the wire services with a headline that was designed to grab attention. Donahue Enterprises majority shareholder exposes systematic fraud and environmental violations. It was followed immediately by a comprehensive shareholder memo that detailed every single piece of evidence we'd gathered. Bank records, forged documents, fraudulent permits, offshore accounts, everything. But the real masterstroke was the digital leak. Rhea had contacts at 3 different investigative journalism outlets, and she fed them the complete documentation package simultaneously. Not summaries or excerpts, but the actual bank statements, the actual forged inspection reports, the actual emails discussing how to hide money from auditors. Raw, unfiltered evidence that told the story better than any narrative we could have written. I stayed up all night watching it unfold on my laptop like some kind of beautiful disaster. The first story broke on a financial blog at 1:23 a.m. By 2:15, it had been picked up by Reuters. By 3:30, Bloomberg had confirmed the story with their own sources. By 4:45, it was trending on Twitter with the hashtag Donahue Fraud. Social media was a thing of beauty to watch. Once the story hit Twitter, it spread like wildfire. People were sharing screenshots of the documents, creating infographics that explained the fraud in simple terms, and making memes about rich families getting their comeuppance. The combination of financial corruption, environmental crimes, and family drama was like catnip for the internet. Everyone loves a story about entitled rich people getting exposed for being criminals. By sunrise, my phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. News alerts, social media mentions, text messages from people I hadn't heard from in years who'd seen my name in the headlines. But the best notifications were the ones from major news networks, CNN, MSNBC, Fox Business. All of them scrambling to confirm the story and get interviews with anyone connected to the situation. Blake's face was plastered across every financial news channel by 7 a.m. The photo they kept using was from some charity gala where he looked particularly smug and entitled, holding a glass of champagne and wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The contrast between that image and the headlines about fraud and assault was perfect. It told the whole story without needing any additional commentary. Julian's mugshot was even better. Not an actual mugshot. He hadn't been arrested yet, but a corporate headshot from the company website that made him look exactly like what he was. A wealthy, arrogant executive who thought he was untouchable. News anchors were using words like alleged and reportedly, but their tone made it clear they believed every word of the accusations. Around 8 a.m., my phone started ringing with calls from reporters wanting interviews, but I let them all go to voicemail. This wasn't the time for me to be the face of the story. The documents spoke for themselves, and I wanted the focus to be on the crimes, not on me personally. Besides, I had more important things to do, like running the company they thought I'd never touch. Miriam started texting me around 8:30. The first message was just, "Carter, what did you do?" followed by a string of increasingly frantic messages as the full scope of the media coverage became clear. 47 texts in total, ranging from confused to angry to desperate to pleading. I read every single one of them, but I didn't respond to any because I was busy. Busy being the majority shareholder of a billion-dollar company that was about to need some serious leadership changes. Busy preparing for board meetings and press conferences and all the other responsibilities that come with actually owning the empire that other people had built on lies. By morning, the Donahue mansion looked like a war zone. I drove past it on my way to the office just to see the circus for myself and counted at least 15 news vans parked along the circular driveway. Reporters with perfectly styled hair were doing live broadcasts on the front lawn, using the mansion's imposing columns as a backdrop while they explained the unfolding scandal to viewers eating breakfast across the country. The family's high-priced PR team had jumped ship overnight. The firm that had been managing their public image for over a decade released a terse statement around 6 a.m., announcing they were ending their professional relationship with Donahue Enterprises, effective immediately. When your own spin doctors abandon you, you know you're completely screwed. Board members were scrambling like rats fleeing a sinking ship. My phone was buzzing with calls from directors trying to distance themselves from Julian and Blake, suddenly remembering that they'd always had concerns about certain business practices but had been overruled by family leadership. It was pathetic, watching these powerful people who'd rubber-stamped every decision for years suddenly develop consciences when the cameras started rolling. Ray and I held our press conference at 10 a.m. in the conference room of her D.C. law firm. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and enough recording equipment to power a small radio station. I practiced my statement dozens of times, but when I looked out at all those faces, I felt completely calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. This was about accountability, I said, looking directly into the cameras, and about the workers, engineers, and people they called nothing. I explained how I'd discovered the fraud, how I'd legally acquired controlling interest in the company, and how we intended to cooperate fully with federal investigators. I kept it professional, factual, and brief. The evidence spoke for itself. Around 2 p.m., Miriam showed up at my office. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them. Security tried to stop her, but I told them to let her through. This conversation was long overdue. "You ruined us," she said, standing in my doorway like she was afraid to come any closer. I looked up from the acquisition papers I'd been reviewing, documents that would officially transfer control of 3 subsidiary companies to new management. "No, Miriam, you ruined yourselves. I just turned the lights on." She tried to argue, tried to explain how her family had made mistakes, but didn't deserve this level of public humiliation. I listened for a while, watching her use the same manipulation tactics she'd been perfecting since childhood, trying to make me feel guilty for exposing their crimes. When she was done, I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. "Your brother assaulted me last night," I said quietly, Your father stole millions of dollars from his own company. Your family has been committing environmental fraud for years, and you want me to feel sorry for you because people found out. That afternoon, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. I participated via video conference, watching as Julian tried to maintain control of a room that had already decided his fate. The vote wasn't even close. Julian Donahue was removed as chairman by a margin of 8-1, with only Blake voting to support his father. Blake was arrested the next morning for securities fraud. The FBI showed up at his apartment at 6 a.m. with handcuffs and a warrant, and by 7 a.m., footage of him doing the perp walk in his pajamas was all over social media. Watching him stumble down those courthouse steps with his hands cuffed behind his back felt like the closing of a very long, very painful chapter of my life. The company was mine now, officially and completely. But as I sat in Julian's old office that evening, looking out at the city lights and thinking about everything that had led to this moment, I realized the war wasn't over yet. Justice was just getting started. A week later, Raina called me with the kind of excitement in her voice that meant she'd found something big. "Carter, you need to get down here right now," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "I found something that changes everything." I drove to her office through downtown DC traffic, my mind racing through possibilities. We'd already exposed the financial fraud, the environmental violations, and the corporate cover-ups. What else could there be? But knowing the Donahues the way I'd come to know them, I should have expected that their crimes went deeper than anyone had imagined. Rhea was waiting for me in her conference room, surrounded by laptops, legal documents, and what looked like the digital equivalent of a detective's evidence board. She'd been working with a team of forensic accountants and computer specialists, following every digital trail the Donahues had left behind over the past decade. "We found an encrypted file buried in Julian's old email server," she said, pulling up a folder on her screen. "It took our tech guys 3 days to crack it, but when they did," she paused, and I could see something in her expression that I'd never seen before. Reddy was tough as nails, the kind of lawyer who could stare down corporate executives and government officials without blinking. But right now, she looked shaken. "What is it?" I asked. "Voicemails," she said quietly. "From Gloria Donahue, Miriam and Blake's real mother." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Gloria had died in a car accident about 8 years ago before I'd married into the family. I'd never met her, but from everything I'd heard, she'd been the one decent person in the entire Donahue clan. Miriam always spoke about her with genuine warmth, not the calculated affection she showed toward the rest of her family. Raina clicked play on the first file. Gloria's voice filled the room, soft, educated, with just a hint of the southern accent that Julian had never quite been able to erase from his own speech. The timestamp showed it was recorded about 6 months before her death. "Julian, I know what you and Blake have been doing," Gloria's voice said, calm but firm. "I've seen the bank records, the fake invoices, the offshore accounts. I know about the environmental reports you've been falsifying. This has to stop." The next voicemail was more urgent. Recorded a week later. "I've spoken with a lawyer. If you don't come clean voluntarily, I'm going to the authorities myself. I won't let you destroy everything we built with your greed." But it was the final voicemail that made my hands shake. The timestamp showed it was recorded the day before Gloria's fatal car accident. Her voice was different, scared, desperate, like someone who knew she was running out of time. "I'm leaving the firm tomorrow," she said, her words rushed and breathless. "I can't be part of this anymore, Julian. If anything happens to me, if there's any kind of accident or..." She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. If anything happens to me, Julian was behind it. He knows I have copies of everything. He knows I was going to expose him. I've hidden the evidence where he'll never find it, and I've made arrangements for it to be released if something happens to me." The recording ended there, leaving us sitting in stunned silence. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Ray was already pulling up news articles about Gloria's accident on her other laptop. "Single car crash on a rainy night," she read. "Vehicle went off the road and hit a tree. No witnesses. Police ruled it an accident due to weather conditions." I stared at the screen, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place in my mind. They killed her. "We need to reopen this case," Ray said, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "This is evidence of murder, not just financial fraud." That evening, I sat in my apartment listening to Gloria's voicemails over and over again. This woman, Miriam's mother, the grandmother of children who would never be born, had tried to do the right thing. She'd discovered the same corruption I'd found, but unlike me, she tried to handle it within the family first. She'd given them a chance to come clean, to stop the fraud before it destroyed innocent people. And they'd killed her for it. Julian tried to run. The coward actually thought he could slip away in the middle of the night like some common criminal fleeing a crime scene. Federal agents caught him at Reagan National Airport trying to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands with 2 suitcases full of cash and a fake passport that probably cost him more than most people make in a year. The photo of him being led away in handcuffs made the front page of every major newspaper in the country. He didn't make it far, because Raina had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. The moment we'd found Gloria's voicemails, she'd contacted the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and every other law enforcement agency that might have jurisdiction over a case involving murder, financial fraud, and environmental crimes. She'd also quietly filed motions to freeze all Donahue family assets, preventing Julian from accessing the offshore accounts he'd been planning to use for his escape. Rich guys always think they're smarter than everyone else. Raina told me as we watched the news coverage of Julian's arrest. They spend their whole lives buying their way out of problems, so they never learn how to actually solve them. The federal prosecutors were practically salivating over the case we'd handed them. Financial fraud, environmental violations, securities manipulation, and now potential murder charges. It was the kind of high-profile prosecution that could make careers. They assigned a team of 12 attorneys to handle different aspects of the case, treating it like the massive criminal enterprise it actually was. Working with the prosecutors was surprisingly straightforward. I spent days in federal buildings walking investigators through every piece of evidence we'd collected, explaining the technical aspects of the environmental fraud, and detailing how Julian and Blake had systematically looted their own company. Every document I'd copied, every bank record I'd photographed, every forge permit I discovered became part of an ironclad case that would be impossible for any defense team to overcome. The Donahue estate was seized within a week of Julian's arrest. Federal marshals showed up with trucks and started loading everything that could be considered evidence or criminal proceeds. Artwork, jewelry, cars, even the furniture. Watching that massive house get gutted was oddly therapeutic. All those symbols of wealth and power that had intimidated me for years were just stuff. Just objects that could be loaded onto trucks and carted away. Miriam surprised everyone by taking a plea deal. Her lawyers had initially tried to claim she was an innocent victim who knew nothing about her family's crimes. But when prosecutors threatened to charge her as a co-conspirator, she folded faster than a house of cards. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony against Julian and Blake, she got community service, house arrest, and mandatory therapy. The day she came to give her deposition was the first time I'd seen her since that confrontation in my office. She looked smaller somehow, like all the confidence and entitlement had been drained out of her. When she testified about what she'd known and when she'd known it, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted to the prosecutors. "The numbers never made sense. And Daddy was always having these private meetings with Blake that they wouldn't let me attend. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think my own family could be criminals."
The trial itself was a media circus that lasted 3 months. Every day brought new revelations, new evidence, and new examples of just how deep the corruption had gone. Blake's defense team tried to paint him as a victim of his father's influence, a young man who'd been manipulated into participating in crimes he didn't understand. It might have worked if we hadn't had recordings of him bragging to friends about how much money they were stealing. Blake cried during the sentencing phase, actual tears streaming down his face as he begged the judge for mercy. He talked about how sorry he was, how he'd learned his lesson, how he just wanted a chance to make things right. It was the most emotion I'd ever seen him display, and it was completely hollow. The judge saw right through it. 18 years, she said, banging her gavel with the kind of finality that meant there would be no appeals, no early release, no wealthy family connections to save him. Julian got life in prison. When they read the verdict, he didn't flinch, didn't react at all. He just sat there like a statue, probably still believing that somehow his money and connections would find a way to save him. But there's no buying your way out of a federal murder conviction, especially when the evidence is as overwhelming as what we presented. I stood on the courthouse steps after the sentencing, breathing in the crisp autumn air and feeling a weight lift from my chest that I'd been carrying for years. It was done. Justice had been served. Not revenge, but actual justice. The people who thought they were untouchable had learned otherwise. And the victims they'd left behind finally had some measure of peace. 1 year later, I stood in the cemetery where Gloria Donahue was buried, holding a bouquet of white tulips that I'd learned were her favorite flowers. The headstone was simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious monuments that wealthy families usually erect for themselves. Just her name, her dates, and a simple inscription: "Beloved Mother and Truth Teller." The cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the oak trees that surrounded her grave. I'd come here alone, without cameras or reporters or anyone else who might turn this private moment into another piece of media coverage. This wasn't about public relations or corporate image. This was about paying my respects to a woman who tried to do the right thing and died because of it. "You tried to stop them," I said quietly, placing the flowers at the base of her headstone. "You saw what they were doing and you tried to make it right. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to finish what you started." Gloria had been the one good soul in that entire family, and they'd silenced her rather than face the consequences of their actions. But her voice hadn't been silenced forever. Those voicemails she'd left, the evidence she'd hidden, the courage she'd shown in her final days. All of it had helped bring down the corrupt empire her husband and son had built on lies and stolen money. I finished what she started, but it had taken me 6 years to find the courage and the means to do it. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if she'd lived, if she'd been able to expose their crimes before they had grown so massive and destructive. Maybe Blake would have gotten the help he needed instead of becoming a criminal. Maybe Julian would have faced consequences before his greed consumed everything decent about him. Maybe a lot of innocent people wouldn't have suffered. But there was no point in dwelling on what-ifs. What mattered was what we'd built from the ashes of their corruption. Donahue Enterprises didn't exist anymore. That name had become too toxic, too associated with fraud and environmental destruction to ever recover. In its place, we'd created Wells Energy Solutions,
a company that actually lived up to the values that Julian and Blake had only pretended to care about. The transition hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. We'd had to rebuild from the ground up, establishing new relationships with clients who'd been burned by the previous management, hiring new employees to replace the ones who'd been complicit in the fraud, and implementing oversight systems that would prevent future corruption.
The clean energy division that I'd worked so hard to build was now the core of our operations, but we'd expanded it in ways that the old Donahue management never would have considered. We weren't just developing technology anymore. We were making it accessible to communities that had been ignored by the traditional energy industry. Solar installations in low-income neighborhoods, wind farms that actually benefited the local communities instead of just extracting resources from them. Battery storage systems that could help developing countries leapfrog over outdated power grids. The Gloria Fund was my proudest achievement, though. We'd established it with money recovered from the Donahue family's offshore accounts, creating a foundation that supported young inventors and entrepreneurs who were trying to develop clean energy solutions. The fund specifically focused on people who'd been told they'd never amount to anything. Kids from poor families, immigrants who didn't have connections, women and minorities who'd been shut out of traditional funding networks. Every month, I got reports about the projects we were supporting. A teenager in Detroit who designed a more efficient solar panel using recycled materials. A team of engineering students from a community college in rural Kentucky who developed a wind turbine that could work in low-wind environments. A single mother in Phoenix who'd created a battery storage system that could be manufactured in her garage. These were the people who represented the future of energy innovation, and they were getting their chance because Gloria Donahue had been brave enough to speak truth to power. At the dedication ceremony for the Gloria Fund headquarters, I'd looked out at the crowd of young inventors, community leaders, and environmental advocates who'd gathered to celebrate what we were building together. The building itself was a testament to sustainable design: solar panels, geothermal heating, rainwater collection systems, everything built with materials that had been recycled or sustainably sourced. It was the kind of project that the old Donahue Enterprises never could have built, because they'd never cared about anything beyond their own profit margins. I saw Miriam in the crowd that day, standing near the back like she wasn't sure she belonged there. She'd been out of house arrest for about 6 months by then, doing community service at a food bank and attending the therapy sessions that were part of her plea agreement. She looked different, older, more tired, but also somehow more real than she'd ever looked during our marriage. The artificial polish was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. After the ceremony, she'd approached me carefully like she was afraid I might call security or make a scene. We stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just looking at each other across the wreckage of everything we'd once shared. "I'm proud of what you've built," she said finally, her voice quiet but sincere. "This is what it should have been all along." I nodded, accepting what felt like the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. "Your mother would have loved this," I replied. She gave me a sad smile and a nod before disappearing back into the crowd. It wasn't forgiveness. Too much had happened for that. But it was acknowledgement. Recognition that we'd both learned painful lessons about the difference between what people say they value and what they actually do when their values are tested. Rhea stood beside me as we watched the last of the crowd disperse. Young inventors and environmental advocates heading back to their workshops and laboratories to continue the work of building a better future. "You did it," she said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that came from knowing we'd achieved something meaningful. I looked out at the solar panels glinting on the rooftop.
at the young people discussing their projects with the enthusiasm that comes from believing you can actually change the world, at the building that bore Gloria's name and would stand as a monument to the idea that truth and justice could still prevail over greed and corruption. We did it. I corrected her, and this time it's real. The empire was real now, built on innovation instead of fraud, powered by hope instead of fear. Creating value instead of just extracting it. This was what Gloria had been fighting for in her final days, and what I'd been working towards since that night. I'd crash through those glass doors. Not revenge, not even justice, but the chance to build something better from the ruins of what came before. It was everything I'd ever wanted. And it had been worth every broken piece of glass.